Did you know that kinky wellness is integral to your self-development? Hi, welcome to The Partition, home of kinky wellness, the ultimate destination to explore the integral connection between kinky wellness and your personal development. I'm your host and kinky wellness coach, Dana Schurgel, and I'm here to show why kinky sexual wellness deserves a rightful spot within the wellness conversation. Don't forget to join me each Monday as I bring on a special guest to dive into specific aspects of kinky wellness. So let's strip away the shame and taboo together and have an open conversation about it. Hey, welcome back. In this episode, I'm going to be talking all about the importance of validation, from different types of validation, what happens to us when we don't receive validation, how we grow self-validation, and the differences between healthy and unhealthy forms of validation. In definition, validation is the action of checking or proving the validity or accuracy of something. And when it comes to personal development or interpersonal relationships, there are many different types of validations that can be given and received. The first form is emotional validation, right? Emotional validation is when you acknowledge and accept how another person is feeling. And you can do this by providing empathy, understanding, and support for whatever emotion that person is currently feeling, even if you don't agree. Because, when it comes to emotional validation, a lot of times when someone acts out with very big emotions, to things that maybe you consider small, there typically tends to be a much larger and deeper story behind that emotion than whatever is actually happening. So just be mindful of that and understand that emotions come from somewhere. Another form of validation is behavioral validation, which is pretty straightforward. And this is when you acknowledge someone's efforts and achievements regarding their behaviors and actions. So a good example of this is acknowledging someone's ability to quit smoking, or even if they're attempting, because a big component of quitting smoking or changing any bad habit for that matter definitely involves changing the habit of behavior in the first place. Another one that's very valid to kinky wellness and just life in general is a validation of boundaries, which is when you honor someone else's physical, emotional, and psychological boundaries, limits, and preferences. But make no mistake that you just have to honor other people's boundaries. Think of your own boundaries and limits. Because when you hold your own boundaries and limits, you are actually already practicing in a form of self-validation. Because the first person who needs to stick up for you is you. So when it comes to personal boundaries, I want you to look at them as like little promises. And when you make those little promises to yourself, don't break those promises, because then it becomes a lie. And when you lie to yourself, that's when you can lie to anybody. But in the same breath, boundaries and limits can change. So act accordingly and reflect on your decisions routinely. Another big form of validation is validation of autonomy, which is when we allow ourselves and others to have independence of their and our own decisions. And the last one for today is validation of experience, which is when we acknowledge another person's struggles and wins. And although this is nowhere near close to a complete list of all the different validations that are out there, in a nutshell, validation is what allows us to feel seen, heard, and understood, and plays a crucial role in how we develop, not only with ourselves, but with our relationships. Validation is truly one of the most important elements in our human development. As adults, we all know how frustrating it is when we aren't validated for our efforts. It fucking sucks. But as children, not receiving a sufficient amount of validation has devastating impacts on their emotional and psychological well-being. For example, when a child is raised in a home where they didn't receive a lot of validation, they will most likely grow up into an adult who has low self-esteem, low sense of self-worth, and they will probably doubt themselves a lot because they weren't shown how to gain inner confidence because they didn't even know what that felt like. And when someone isn't taught how to validate themselves, then there's a few things that can happen. One, they will most likely grow up to be a person who struggles to regulate their emotions, because since they have no inner validation of who they are is okay, they most likely will have those spaces filled with the feelings of insecurity, doubt, and anxiety. Two, they could turn into a perfectionist to overcompensate. Or three, they could find themselves in a trap of constantly seeking external validation from wherever they can get it. So it can come from a bad friend group, Maybe they work extra hard for a job that's undeserving, or maybe they end up in a codependent relationship where they become reliant on their partner for validation. One of a worst case scenario is that that person ends up with someone who just reinforces that person's lack of validation in the first place, which makes sense because, when people have low validation, they typically have difficulty expressing their emotions and needs, which leaves them open to predatory people. But I want to be clear on something. I want you to know that there's nothing wrong with wanting external validation either. It's a natural and healthy desire, and it's literally needed for proper development. Validation only becomes a problem when someone is only receiving external validation and not attempting to give it to themselves. Because let's be real, sometimes we get low, sometimes we lose our way, and getting validation from others can keep us motivated. Kind of puts us back on track. Track stars get validation from their coaches, students get validation from their teachers, even employers have Employee of the Month. So, why can't we use our sex life to gain validation? It's fun, it's adventurous, and it can be tailored to you. For instance, let's say you need validation for an experience. Kinky Wellness can build that arena for you, right? Let's say you want emotional validation. And regardless of how you want it, Kinky Wellness can do that too. Let's say you want to learn more about autonomy validation. Well, Kinky Wellness also has you covered because in ethical and consenting BDSM and kink and Kinky Wellness in general, you are in control. And although, yes, I do understand that there are people right now using BDSM and kink as a form of validation in unhealthy ways, this doesn't mean that you need to do that. If you're listening to this, I trust that you are someone who wants to increase their self-awareness and authenticity and not someone who wants to self-sabotage themselves. But anyways, it's clear we live in a world where we're allowed to validate each other, but only in certain areas. Because once again, if you want to validate yourself on your own terms in your own sexual personal life, then all of a sudden it becomes a weird taboo topic. But once again, Kinky Wellness can help you create ethical and consenting ways to gain validation that works for you. Again, there's nothing wrong with giving and receiving validation. Maybe you got all the emotional validation that you needed as a child, but right now you're working a job that doesn't care about you at all, and your feelings of being validated are shrinking, and it's affecting your mood. Well, Kinky Wellness can help balance that out for you by providing a space where you can tailor activities that give you the embodiment of validation. And really, it wasn't until I felt deep validation from others, within the Kinky Wellness space, that's where I was able to create that deep validation for myself because I had something to reference to. Regardless, as humans, we want to be seen. We want to be heard. We want to be recognized, and we want to be validated. And really, I believe that just existing sometimes deserves some validation from time to time. It's hard to exist sometimes. And if you are someone who is actively trying to better themselves, then yeah, that deserves validation too. Because as we know, our deep, painful growth typically happens behind closed doors. It's when no one's watching where the hardest parts of growth happen. And personally, I truly believe that any type of growth should be validated, not just professionally. So yeah, go ahead and turn your bedroom into a place where you can get validation or give validation for all those little and big things you do, and for the stuff that doesn't get noticed. Because so many amazing things happen to us when we begin to gain a healthy balance of validation. We start to feel better in our own skin. We gain more confidence to become more authentic. We gain more courage to pursue whatever our best interests are. And it helps us to express ourselves freely. And just in case you're someone who is struggling to give yourself some inner validation, or maybe you know someone who could use some more inner validation, here are some ways that can help. You can start by acknowledging and recognizing your own emotions without judgment, which is easier said than done, I know. But remember, self-validation is a skill like any other. So that means that it will take time, effort, and practice to develop. But you need to start somewhere, so why not now? Other ways to provide validation to yourself is by practicing self-compassion and self-empathy, trusting your own judgment, again, setting your own boundaries and then honoring them. Start focusing on your strengths or past accomplishments, no matter how small they might be. And really, you have to challenge any negative self-talk that you may have. Because often when someone doesn't have enough validation, they feel worthless, and no one is worthless. Not you, not me, not even your worst enemy. Everyone has worth. Maybe it's just not to you, but people still have worth. But seriously, don't underestimate the power of validation. Validation is fuel for our development, like we've said. But like all things, not all forms of validation are healthy. Unhealthy validation includes enabling destructive behaviors or unhealthy coping mechanisms, like, our binge drinking culture, or constantly reassuring someone who engages in self destructive behaviors without actually encouraging them to seek help. Another form of unhealthy validation is giving someone false reassurance or minimizing their concerns. A good example of this is telling somebody everything's going to be fine without actually, acknowledging the situation or their feelings, which will be taken as a very dismissive and ultimately invalidating thing. Another big form of unhealthy validation is giving validation, but only on certain conditions. In some contexts, this might work, right? Like a professional setting, your boss tells you to do the thing, you do the thing, you get validated, it's good. But doing this to a child is only going to hinder its development. And really giving validation or love or anything like that on certain conditions is just a form of manipulation. But in the end, any form of validation that perpetuates a very negative pattern or hinders personal development and emotional well-being, all of that should be considered unhealthy forms of validation. We also need to watch where we receive validation too. Not everyone is going to have your best interests at heart, which means some people will validate you for their own emotional benefit, for their own financial benefit, and own physical benefit. Whatever it is, there are some people that can use validation as a form of manipulation. Or you might be in a friend group or some sort of situation where people will validate your shitty behavior so they don't have to take accountability for themselves either. However, on the flip side, as I've mentioned, healthy validation includes characteristics like active listening, showing or receiving empathy, affirming effort, and being consistent about it. Which leads me to my next point. I want to encourage you to validate yourself and the ones around you for the little things, because it's easy for us to validate each other during the big things. It's actually expected of us to validate each other during the big things. But it's when you take the time and start validating the little things that really helps to keep that momentum going. But this was also really hard to write, actually, because as I mentioned, of being careful of where you get validation. A lot of points were about you have to validate regardless, and I said sometimes it's okay to disagree, right? Like sometimes it's okay to give validation when you don't actually agree, in the sense of someone is going through a trigger and you don't know what's happening, but you're just validating that they're not okay. That's something that's okay. But, when it comes to validating everything all the time, no matter what, do I believe we need to validate everything around us all the time? I'm not sure. That's a tough question. Because ultimately, like you guys know, I believe that people don't need to agree on everything all the time, right? I think it's okay to have different opinions without penalizing whatever side is speaking, whatever their truth is. I don't care, right? Everyone has their own voice that they can say whatever they want. You don't have to agree. But fundamentally, if you don't agree with someone and then you give them validation anyways, then one, it's not genuine. So what's the point of that? And I also believe on this topic that even if you don't agree, like you don't want to validate whatever's happening because maybe that's not your belief and that's okay. You can still interact with someone with respect, proper communication. You can still act like a decent human being, even if you agree or disagree. So, just because you don't want to validate something doesn't mean you have to be an asshole about it. And just because someone doesn't want to validate someone doesn't mean that they're being a jerk either. So I'm not sure. That was really tough. Do I believe that we need to validate everything? So I want to ask you guys that. Do you think we need to validate everything? Do you think giving validation is a personal choice? But we can fight about it in the comment section. But that's all I have for the importance of validation. But as for Monday, yes, our Monday guest, we are going to be joined by the lovely Genevieve, aka Evie Jones. Genevieve is a solo performance artist first-year PhD student studying interdisciplinary and humanities and is actually my cousin. So yeah, make sure to come back on Monday and join us for a fun and chill conversation as we talk about the power of vulnerability, resistance, and suffering and what that looks like within her work. Also, if you aren't following the Partition, home of Kinky Wellness, yet on YouTube, what are you waiting for? Please do me a favor and share. I see that you guys are sharing it. I do appreciate that. But make sure that you also subscribe. So follow the link in the description and click that subscribe button and stay up to date. And yeah, and I will be eternally grateful. But yeah, that's it for me. Thank you for waiting for this episode, and I will chat with you next week. As always, you guys know what to do. Stay kinky.